The winter rain fell in thin sheets across Portland, tracing silver lines on the kitchen window where Julia Dawson stood with a cup of tea cooling in her hands. At 32, she had carved out a quiet life for herself, teaching English at a local high school, grading essays late into the night, and finding comfort in routine. Her apartment was modest but warm, lined with shelves of books and a scattering of plants. She fussed over the way other people fussed over children. Stability had become her armor after years of disappointment, and she guarded it carefully. That evening, Michael Dawson leaned back in his chair at her small dining table, finishing the last of the cookies she had baked. He was handsome in a way that drew attention, confident in his movements, always dressed as though he had stepped out of a business magazine. Julia had been drawn to his energy when they met a year earlier, the way he seemed so certain of the world while she often felt hesitant. As he pushed aside his empty plate, Michael spoke with casual finality. "Julia, Mom and Aunt Linda are insisting I bring you to meet them this year. They're expecting us on New Year's Eve." The words dropped into the room like a weight. Julia nearly spilled her tea, her hand trembling before she set the cup down. She tried to hide the quick surge of panic rising in her chest, but her voice betrayed her. "This New Year's Eve? That's only a week away. I don't know if I'll be ready." Michael smiled as if her worry amused him. "Don't overthink it. They're not going to bite. We'll toast, eat some salad, and then head back here to celebrate on our own like we planned. They just want to meet the woman I've been serious about." Julia forced a smile, though her heart pounded. Serious. The word should have brought her comfort, but instead it pressed down on her like an obligation. She remembered the last time a man had spoken of seriousness. Years earlier, her college sweetheart had promised her forever, only for her to discover he had been seeing someone else behind her back. That betrayal had cut her deeply, leaving scars she still felt whenever trust was required. She had spent years avoiding relationships, focusing on her students and her family, convincing herself she didn't need anyone. Michael had been the first man to break through those defenses, but the idea of stepping into his family's world terrified her. "I don't even have the right clothes for something like this," she murmured, staring at the stack of lesson plans waiting on the counter as if they could shield her. "Your family will expect me to look polished. I'm a teacher, Michael. I live in cardigans and flats." He laughed, shaking his head. "Julia, you're beautiful in anything. Stop worrying about gifts and dresses. If you really want, I'll grab some chocolates and wine on the way. That's plenty." But Julia knew she could never walk into a new family empty-handed. Her upbringing, her sense of respect, demanded more. Already her mind began cataloging possible gifts, homemade treats, maybe something thoughtful, but not extravagant. Yet, even as she considered these details, unease twisted in her stomach. Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, muttered something about end-of-year contracts, and stood to leave. At the door, he kissed her cheek with practiced ease. "I'll pick you up around noon on the 31st. Don't stress, Julia. They'll love you." She watched from the window as he disappeared into the drizzle, not once looking back. Her chest ached with the familiar sensation of being left behind, though she told herself she was being silly. That night, she opened her closet and stared at the neat row of skirts and blouses. Nothing felt right. She remembered the way her grandmother used to say that clothes weren't just fabric, they were armor. And right now, Julia felt unarmed. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she whispered into the quiet apartment, "What if they don't like me?" The silence offered no answer, only the patter of rain against the glass. She thought again of her past, of how love had once left her broken, and wondered if she was strong enough to risk that pain again. Yet she also remembered Evelyn, Michael's grandmother, whom she had not yet met, but who, according to Michael, still clung fiercely to life despite illness. A woman like that would demand courage, not hesitation. Slowly, Julia closed the closet doors. She exhaled, long and steady, feeling a flicker of resolve. Whatever fears she carried, She would face them. She would go with Michael to meet his family. And so, with a heart full of doubt but a spine stiffened by determination, Julia Dawson decided to accept the invitation that would change the course of her life. Snow dusted the sidewalks of Portland as Julia followed Michael up the stone steps to a sprawling house in the West Hills. The Dawson home looked every bit as imposing as she had feared. Tall windows glowing warmly against the winter dusk, a manicured yard wrapped in holiday lights, and the heavy silence of wealth pressing down on the front porch. Julia adjusted the scarf around her neck, clutching the bag of carefully wrapped gifts she had chosen after days of indecision. Michael rang the bell without hesitation. The door opened almost instantly to reveal Linda Dawson, his mother. She was impeccably dressed in a deep burgundy sweater and pearls, her eyes sharp behind stylish glasses. At her side stood Aunt Victoria, slightly younger, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom! Aunt Victoria, this is Julia," Michael announced, his tone carrying both pride and expectation. "Julia," Linda said smoothly, extending her hand. "At last. We've heard so much about you." Julia smiled and offered the bag of gifts, locally roasted coffee, artisanal chocolates, and a small potted plant. "It's so nice to meet you. I wanted to bring a little something." "How thoughtful," Victoria said, her voice pleasant but tinged with curiosity, as though already measuring Julia's choices. They ushered her inside, the house smelling faintly of cinnamon and polished wood. A table was set in the dining room, the kind of arrangement Julia had only seen in magazines, crystal glasses, silver flatware, and candles flickering against white linen. Conversation over dinner began cordially. Linda asked about Julia's work at the high school, nodding with polite interest, while Victoria interjected with questions that felt less like curiosity and more like examination. "Teaching teenagers must be challenging," Victoria remarked. "Do you ever worry that it takes too much of your energy, leaving little for family?" Julia answered carefully, aware of the weight in every glance exchanged between mother and aunt. She tried to steady her nerves, reminding herself that Michael had insisted they were kind women once you knew them. Still, she felt their eyes studying her posture, her words, even the way she held her fork. Michael, oblivious or unwilling to notice, spoke confidently about his work and upcoming contracts, dominating the conversation until his phone buzzed on the table. He frowned, excused himself, and stepped into the kitchen. Julia sipped her water, forcing a smile as Linda inquired about her parents. Before Julia could answer fully, Michael returned, his expression unsettled. "That was Grandma Evelyn," he said, lowering his voice as though it were an inconvenience. "She checked herself out of the hospital this afternoon. She wants someone to pick her up and drive her to her house in the country tonight." Linda sighed, exasperated. "Of course she does. She never considers how impossible her timing is. On New Year's Eve, no less." Victoria scoffed. "Michael, you can't possibly drive all the way out there. The roads are terrible, and you've already had wine. She'll manage. She always does." Julia glanced between them, unsettled. She was just discharged? "From the hospital." "Yes," Michael muttered. "She claims the doctors agreed she was stable enough to leave. But she sounded weak. I can't just ignore her." Linda waved a dismissive hand. "Call a rideshare. Let her take an Uber. She chose to leave against medical advice, didn't she? That's not our burden tonight." Something in Julia recoiled at the coldness in the room. She imagined the elderly woman alone, frail, waiting in the bitter night for someone to care enough. Julia's voice rose before she could stop herself. "She can stay with me. I have a guest room. It would be easier than sending her out to a motel or making her travel in this weather." The table went silent. Michael blinked at her, surprised. Victoria raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's generous," Linda said slowly, though the edge in her tone was unmistakable. "I mean it." Julia continued, steady now despite her pounding heart. "If she needs a safe place to rest until she feels stronger, I'd be happy to have her. It's no trouble." Michael's expression softened, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Julia. Really, that would solve everything." Linda and Victoria exchanged a glance that spoke volumes: disapproval, calculation, perhaps even curiosity at Julia's boldness. But none of them could argue. The decision had been made, and Julia knew it was more than politeness driving her. It was instinct, the same instinct that had carried her through heartbreak before. The refusal to stand by while someone was abandoned. As the dinner conversation stumbled back into motion, Julia realized that in offering her home to Evelyn Dawson, she had taken her first irreversible step into Michael's family drama, one that would test her resolve in ways she could not yet imagine. The following afternoon, Julia opened her apartment door to the sound of hesitant footsteps in the hallway. Michael stood there, his expression impatient, holding the arm of an elderly woman wrapped in a wool coat far too thin for the winter chill. Evelyn Dawson looked frail, her frame stooped, but her eyes, pale blue and sharp, still held an energy that belied her weakened body. "Grandma, this is Julia," Michael said quickly, as though eager to move the responsibility away from himself. "She's the one who offered you a place to stay." Evelyn's lips parted in a small smile. "So you're Julia. I was beginning to think my grandson had imagined you, the way he kept delaying introductions." Her voice carried humor, though it was touched with exhaustion. Julia stepped forward immediately. "Welcome, Mrs. Dawson. Please come inside. Let me take your coat." Michael helped her across the threshold, his movements efficient but lacking tenderness. Julia caught the subtle tightening of his jaw as Evelyn slowly lowered herself into the armchair by the window. He muttered something about needing to check in at work later, already creating distance. Ignoring him, Julia knelt beside Evelyn and unwrapped the scarf from her neck. "You must be tired after leaving the hospital. I've prepared the guest room for you. It's warm, and the bed is firm but comfortable. Would you like to rest?" Evelyn squeezed her hand, her skin cool and fragile. "Thank you, dear. You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Julia said simply. She led Evelyn down the short hallway, opening the door to a modest but tidy room. The bedspread was freshly laundered, and Julia had placed a vase of white lilies on the nightstand. A stack of folded blankets sat at the foot of the bed, alongside a small basket with tea bags, honey, and a bottle of water. Julia's careful preparation reflected not just politeness but genuine care. Evelyn's eyes watered as she took in the details. "It feels like home already," she whispered. Julia helped her settle, arranging the pillows just so, before sitting on the edge of the chair nearby. They began to talk, the conversation meandering like an old stream through familiar territory. Evelyn shared fragments of her past, memories of raising Michael when his father had left too soon, stories of gardens she once kept, the loneliness of watching her health betray her. Julia listened, nodding, sometimes laughing at Evelyn's sharp wit. The intimacy of their exchange stirred Julia's own memories. She thought of her grandmother, who had passed when Julia was in college. Her grandmother had been the anchor of her childhood, the one who had taught her to bake cinnamon bread and who had whispered encouragement when Julia's parents argued. Listening to Evelyn, she felt as though a piece of that long-lost comfort had returned. In the doorway, Michael shifted his weight, clearly restless. He interrupted with forced cheer. "Well, Grandma, Julia's gone all out for you. I'm sure you'll be fine here. I should head out now, busy week ahead." Evelyn's gaze hardened briefly. "Too busy to sit with your grandmother for a while." Michael chuckled, dismissing the reproach. "You know how it is. Deadlines, clients. Julia will take good care of you." He kissed the top of Evelyn's head quickly, then glanced at Julia. "Don't let her overdo it. She tends to dramatize her health." With that, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that left silence in his wake. Julia turned back to Evelyn, embarrassed on Michael's behalf. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize for him," Evelyn cut in softly. "Michael's been distracted for years. You have nothing to be sorry for." The older woman leaned back against the pillows, her eyes on Julia. "You remind me of someone. Your hands, the way you straighten the blankets. It's the same gentleness my sister once had. People like you are rare, Julia. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Julia felt her throat tighten. She had spent so long doubting her worth, retreating into solitude after betrayal, that hearing such words struck her like sunlight breaking through clouds. That evening, Julia brewed chamomile tea and carried 2 cups into the guest room. Evelyn sat propped up, her cat Morka curled against her legs, purring softly. Together, they sipped tea, the warmth filling the quiet space. They spoke of books, of Portland's endless rain, of the small joys that made life tolerable. It was the beginning of something unexpected, a bond not of obligation but of choice. In Evelyn's gratitude and Julia's instinctive kindness, they found a connection that Michael neither noticed nor valued. As Julia dimmed the light and wished Evelyn good night, she realized that the decision she had made at that dinner table to welcome a frail old woman into her home was already changing her life in ways she could not yet measure. January crept into Portland with its gray skies and constant drizzle. The days felt short, swallowed by low clouds, but inside Julia's apartment there was a warmth she had not felt in years. Evelyn had settled into the guest room as though she had always belonged, her presence transforming the quiet apartment into something richer. Most afternoons, when Julia returned from the high school, she found Evelyn in the living room with Morka purring on her lap, a book balanced in her thin hands. They would talk while Julia made tea, and soon their conversations stretched late into the evening. Evelyn had a way of drawing Julia out, asking about her students, her favorite novels, even the heartbreak she rarely spoke of. Julia, in turn, listened to Evelyn recount stories of raising Michael, of living through winters without central heat, of a world that no longer existed. On Saturdays, Julia bundled Evelyn in a thick coat and scarf, and together they walked slowly down the tree-lined streets near Mount Tabor. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and Evelyn leaned on Julia's arm with a surprising strength for her age. "This is the best medicine," Evelyn would say, pausing to admire the moss on the trees. "Better than anything they gave me in the hospital." Back home, they cooked simple meals together. Evelyn showed Julia how to prepare chicken, soup the way her own mother once did, with dill and just enough garlic. Julia taught her how to bake pumpkin bread, a recipe she used for her students' bake sales. Their laughter filled the kitchen, bridging generations. But if Julia found comfort in Evelyn's company, she found distance growing with Michael. He stopped coming by as often, always citing deadlines and client dinners. His calls grew shorter, his texts less frequent. When he did appear, his presence felt hurried, restless, as though being in Julia's apartment suffocated him. One evening, Julia asked lightly, "Will you stay for dinner? Evelyn wants to make her famous soup again." Michael shook his head, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "I can't. I've got a meeting early tomorrow and I need to prepare. You two enjoy." He kissed Julia's cheek absently before leaving, the door clicking shut with the same finality as it always did. Julia stood there, the soup simmering on the stove, her heart heavy with the familiar weight of being left behind. Evelyn, watching from her armchair, spoke gently. "Don't blame yourself, dear. Michael has always been like this. He chases what he thinks is important, and sometimes he forgets what truly matters." Julia tried to believe her, but unease had begun to root in her chest. The unease grew sharper when she visited Michael's family one Sunday. Linda greeted her with forced warmth, seating her in the glossy living room while Victoria poured tea. Their questions came cloaked in politeness but pierced like needles. So, Julia, Linda began, such a charming apartment you have downtown. Must be cozy for a teacher's salary. Do you own it outright, or? Julia blinked, caught off guard. Yes, I bought it a few years ago. It's small, but it's mine. Victoria's smile widened. How responsible of you. Property is such an asset these days. And with Portland's prices rising, well, it must already be worth quite a lot. Julia felt her throat tighten. The conversation drifted on, but the questions returned again and again, circling her apartment like vultures. Linda asked if Julia had ever considered moving somewhere bigger. Victoria wondered aloud what would happen to the place once you and Michael marry. Julia left that evening with a polite smile fixed on her face. But as she drove home through the rain, her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Their interest hadn't been casual curiosity. It had felt calculated. When she walked into her apartment, Evelyn was waiting, Morka curled beside her. They asked about your place, didn't they? She said, reading Julia's face as if she already knew. Julia hesitated, then nodded. It was strange. I felt like they weren't asking because they cared. More like they were measuring me. Evelyn's eyes softened with sympathy. That's because they were. Don't let them unsettle you. Your home is your sanctuary. Protect it. Julia sat beside her, comforted but still unsettled. She wanted to believe Michael was different, that his mother and aunt's questions had nothing to do with him. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted. As the weeks passed, Julia clung to her bond with Evelyn. Their shared walks, their quiet meals, their laughter, all of it reminded Julia of the grandmother she had lost long ago. And while the rain continued to fall over Portland, Julia began to realize that her apartment was no longer just hers. It had become a refuge, a place of belonging for both herself and Evelyn. But beneath that warmth lay shadows she could no longer ignore. The winter rain showed no sign of easing. Portland streets glistened under the constant drizzle, street lamps casting fractured halos on the pavement. Julia had grown used to the rhythm of rain tapping her windows at night, but lately, that sound had become a companion to her unease. Michael's visits had dwindled further. Days passed with only brief phone calls, always cut short by claims of client dinners, late meetings, or contracts he couldn't afford to lose. He no longer lingered in her apartment, no longer shared quiet breakfasts or laughter over evening tea. Julia told herself it was the season. That work often piled up at the start of the year. But in the pit of her stomach, something twisted. One evening, after a long day at school, she returned home to find Evelyn waiting in the armchair by the window, Morka curled in her lap. The old woman's eyes tracked Julia carefully as she hung up her coat. You haven't seen him much lately, Evelyn said, not unkindly, but with the sharp perception Julia had come to respect. Julia forced a smile. He's busy. Work never stops for Michael. Evelyn stroked Morka's fur slowly. Busy, yes, but sometimes busy is just another word for elsewhere. Don't ignore your instincts, Julia. They've probably tried to warn you before. Julia hesitated, her throat tightening. She lowered herself onto the couch opposite. When I was in college, I thought I had everything figured out. His name was Aaron. We talked about marriage, about the future. I believed him. Then one night, I found out he'd been seeing another woman for months. Everyone else seemed to know, but me. I was the fool who kept believing his excuses. Her voice wavered. The memory was still raw, though years had passed. I promised myself I'd never go through that again, that I'd recognize the signs, trust my gut. But with Michael, I keep giving him the benefit of the doubt. Evelyn leaned forward, her frail hands gripping Julia's. Aaron betrayed you, yes, but you're not a fool for wanting to believe in love. What matters is that you learned something. You learned that silence, distance, the endless excuses, those are signs. You can't pretend not to see them. Julia nodded, though tears pricked her eyes. She wanted to defend Michael, to argue that he was simply overwhelmed. Yet the evidence built against him with each unanswered text, each late-night excuse. Each weekend he promised to visit, but didn't. The following Sunday, Michael's family invited Julia to lunch again. She went reluctantly, hoping to ease the tension she still felt from their last meeting. Linda and Victoria greeted her warmly, their smiles polished, their questions precise. "How's the school year going, dear?" Linda asked, refilling Julia's teacup before steering the conversation in another direction. "And how's your apartment holding up in this weather? You mentioned you live alone. Must feel like a lot of responsibility." Victoria leaned in, eyes sharp. "I suppose once you and Michael marry, it'll make sense for him to take on more of that responsibility. Men should handle property, don't you think?" Julia's stomach nodded. The way they spoke of her home, as though it were already theirs to manage, made her feel stripped bare. She offered non-committal answers, polite smiles, but inside, unease churned like a storm. When she returned home that evening, Evelyn was waiting as always. Julia told her about the lunch, about the questions that lingered like thorns. Evelyn listened, her gaze unwavering. "They're circling you, Julia," she said softly, "like vultures. You have something they want, and they think you're too kind or too blind to see it. Don't let them mistake your kindness for weakness." Julia sat in silence, staring at the rain streaking the window. The glow of the street lamps blurred behind the glass, a perfect reflection of how muddled her thoughts had become. She wanted to believe Michael loved her, that his family's probing had nothing to do with him. But the distance between them grew heavier with each passing day, and the memory of Aaron's betrayal haunted her more fiercely than ever. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt invaded by shadows, Michael's absences, his family's greed, her own gnawing doubts. And though Evelyn's presence brought comfort, Julia could not shake the sense that she was walking once again toward the same heartbreak she had sworn she would never repeat. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in late January. Julia had just returned from the grocery store, her arms full of paper bags, when she found Evelyn collapsed on the kitchen floor. Murka circled her anxiously, meowing, claws clicking against the tiles. "Evelyn." Julia dropped the bags, vegetables rolling across the linoleum as she knelt beside the older woman. Evelyn's face was pale, her breathing shallow, her pulse faint beneath Julia's trembling fingers. Without hesitation, Julia dialed 911. Her voice cracked as she gave the dispatcher the address, every second stretching into eternity. The wail of the approaching sirens felt both too far away and too sudden, and then paramedics burst through the door, taking Evelyn onto a stretcher, attaching monitors, speaking in clipped commands Julia barely understood. At the hospital, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Julia followed the gurney through double doors marked emergency. The smell of antiseptic filled her lungs, making her stomach twist. A nurse asked questions, Evelyn's medications, medical history, and Julia answered as best as she could, her mind spinning. Michael arrived nearly an hour later, his shirt unwrinkled, his demeanor more annoyed than alarmed. "What happened?" he asked, as though Julia had inconvenienced him. "She collapsed," Julia whispered. "They're running tests. She hasn't woken up yet." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I told her she was pushing herself. She never listens. Look, I'll stay for a bit, but I have meetings tomorrow. Don't let this consume you, Julia. She's old, it happens." Julia stared at him in disbelief, her chest tightening. She wanted to shout that this was his grandmother, the woman who had raised him, the one who had remembered every detail of his childhood when he couldn't be bothered. But her voice caught, and all she managed was a hoarse, "She needs us." Michael checked his watch. "She'll have doctors. That's enough." Hours passed. Julia remained at Evelyn's side in the ICU, the steady beep of machines marking time. She held Evelyn's hand, whispering encouragement as nurses adjusted for lines and monitors. Evelyn's face was peaceful, but her stillness frightened Julia more than anything. Late into the night, Evelyn stirred faintly. Her eyelids fluttered open, and her weak voice broke through the hum of machines. "Julia!" Julia leaned closer, tears springing to her eyes. "I'm here. You're safe. Don't try to talk." But Evelyn persisted, her grip surprisingly firm on Julia's hand. "Promise me, take care of Morka. And my funeral. Don't let them rush it. I want to rest next to Henry in Forest Grove Cemetery. Promise." Julia's throat ached as she nodded quickly. "I promise. I'll take care of everything." Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes closing again. The monitors continued their rhythm, but Julia knew those words had cost her dearly. By morning, Evelyn had slipped into a coma. Doctors explained the stroke had been massive, her chances of recovery slim. Julia clung to hope anyway, refusing to leave the hospital. She read aloud from Evelyn's favorite book, brushed her hair gently, and prayed for a miracle. Michael appeared briefly, bringing coffee for himself, his presence more of a formality than a comfort. "Julia, you can't live here. Go home. Get some rest," he said, his tone flat. "I'm not leaving her," Julia replied, her voice steady though her body trembled with exhaustion. He shrugged, kissed her cheek mechanically, and left again. Julia never saw him return that day. 2 nights later, in the quiet hours just before dawn, Evelyn's heart slowed and then stilled. Nurses rushed in, voices urgent, machines shrieking, but Julia felt it before they said the words. She held Evelyn's hand until it grew cold, tears blurring the sterile white walls around her. The doctor's voice was gentle, but the words crushed her nonetheless. "I'm sorry. She's gone." Julia sat frozen, her mind replaying Evelyn's last request. The grief was suffocating, a hollow ache that spread through every corner of her body. She had lost not just Michael's grandmother, but a woman who had begun to feel like her own. Morka would be waiting at home, Julia realized, pacing by the door, crying for the one person who would never return. And Evelyn's words, "Promise me," echoed louder than the machines had. Through the fog of sorrow, Julia made her vow again. She would keep Morka safe. She would arrange the funeral exactly as Evelyn wanted, no matter what Michael or his family said. Grief threatened to pull her under, but beneath it stirred something steadier, resolve. Evelyn had trusted her, and Julia would not betray that trust. Even if she had to stand alone against Michael's family, she would honor Evelyn's wishes. As dawn broke outside the hospital windows, gray light spilling over Portland's rain-slick streets, Julia Dawson sat in the ICU, her heart shattered but her promise unshakable. The morning of the funeral was damp and cold, Portland's skies heavy with low clouds that threatened more rain. Julia stood outside the funeral home on Hawthorne Boulevard, adjusting the black wool coat she had borrowed from Rachel. Her hands trembled as she clutched the small notebook where she had written Evelyn's favorite hymn and the details of her wishes. She had gone over them dozens of times, determined that nothing would be overlooked. Inside, the air was filled with the soft strains of an organ. The casket rested near the front, polished oak adorned with white lilies, Evelyn's favorite. Julia had arranged everything herself: the flowers, the music, the order of service. Michael had barely been involved, arriving only at the last minute and muttering something about how much the arrangements must have cost. His mother, Linda, had nodded curtly, already flipping through the obituary program with little interest in the service itself. To Julia, it felt surreal. Evelyn had trusted her with her final wishes, and she had carried them out to the letter. She had argued with the funeral director when he suggested shortcuts. She had insisted on the cemetery in Forest Grove, next to Evelyn's late husband Henry, despite Linda's protests that it was too far and a simple cremation would have been cheaper. Julia had stood firm, her resolve fueled by the memory of Evelyn's frail hand squeezing hers in the ICU. As mourners filled the pews, Julia recognized neighbors from Evelyn's old street, former church friends, and one woman who hurried over to embrace her, Mrs. Carter, Evelyn's longtime neighbor and closest friend. Tears filled the older woman's eyes as she whispered she would be so grateful. "Julia, you did exactly what you wanted. I can see it in every detail." Julia swallowed hard, her chest tight. "I just wanted to honor her. She deserved that much." During the service, Julia stood to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she described Evelyn's kindness, her humor, the way she had embraced Julia not as an outsider, but as family. She read the hymn Evelyn had loved, and for a moment, even through her grief, she felt Evelyn's presence, a quiet strength settling over her shoulders. When she returned to her seat, she caught Michael's eyes. He looked bored, his gaze wandering to his phone, which he had pulled from his pocket more than once. Linda leaned in to whisper something to him, and Julia noticed how both their expressions sharpened, not with grief, but with calculation. After the service, as mourners filed past to offer condolences, Julia stayed near the casket, thanking each person. Mrs. Carter lingered, lowering her voice. "Be careful, Julia. I know Michael's family. They're already talking about Evelyn's house, her savings, her jewelry. They don't care about her memory, only what they think is theirs now." Julia felt her stomach knot. She had sensed it before in Linda's probing questions, in Victoria's false smiles. Hearing it confirmed by Evelyn's oldest friend made her heart sink even further. Later, at the cemetery in Forest Grove, the ground was soft from rain. The small crowd gathered around as the casket was lowered beside Henry Dawson's grave. Julia clutched Morka's carrier in one hand. She had brought the cat, knowing Evelyn would have wanted her closest companion near. The priest spoke words of final blessing, and Julia's tears blurred the view of the earth swallowing the casket. Michael stood stiffly, glancing at his watch. Linda dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, but seemed more preoccupied with whispering to Victoria about paperwork. Julia caught fragments, will assets, inheritance, and bile rose in her throat. Evelyn hadn't even been in the ground an hour, and already they were circling like scavengers. As the mourners dispersed, Mrs. Carter squeezed Julia's arm. "You did everything right, child. Don't let them tell you otherwise." Julia nodded, though her grief was edged now with something harder. Anger. She had poured her heart into giving Evelyn the farewell she deserved, while the family who should have cared most treated it as an inconvenience. That evening, back at her apartment, Julia set Morka's carrier down and opened the door. The cat padded out slowly, meowing once before leaping onto Evelyn's old chair. Julia collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion washing over her. Michael arrived later, his tie loose, his expression flat. "Mom says we should meet with a lawyer soon," he said. "We need to figure out what happens with Grandma's estate." Julia stared at him, horrified. "She just died, Michael. We buried her today. Can't you think about her for once, instead of what she left behind?" He rolled his eyes. "Don't be dramatic. This is how things work. Estates have to be settled." Her hands shook as she pressed them together in her lap. Evelyn's words echoed again. "Don't let them rush it. Promise me." Julia knew, in that moment, that she was standing at a dangerous crossroads. Grief weighed her down, but beneath it, a resolve was hardening. She had promised Evelyn she would protect her wishes, and she intended to keep that promise, even if Michael and his family tried to strip it all away. The weeks after Evelyn's funeral moved with the sluggish weight of grief. Julia still felt the old woman's absence in every corner of her apartment. The armchair that now sat empty, the tea kettle that seemed quieter without Evelyn's laughter to accompany it. Even Morka, who paced the rooms at night, meowing as if searching for her mistress. Julia did her best to keep her promise, feeding the cat, stroking her fur, whispering reassurances, but the void remained. If Evelyn's death had left Julia fragile, Michael's behavior deepened the fracture. He grew colder, more impatient, returning to her apartment less and less. When he did appear, his visits were short, punctuated by phone calls he answered in another room or texts he typed with his back turned to her. One Friday night, Julia waited with dinner ready, chicken soup the way Evelyn had taught her, only to receive a message at 8 p.m. Running late, don't wait up. She sat at the table alone, the soup cooling in its bowls, Morka winding around her ankles, as if sensing her despair. Another evening, she saw him in the lobby of her building, laughing with someone on the phone before slipping into an Uber without even coming upstairs. Julia froze at the sight, her breath catching. The laugh had been too carefree, too familiar, the kind of laugh he hadn't shared with her in months. The name Crystal more surfaced one night in conversation, almost by accident. Michael mentioned her as a new consultant he was working with, his tone too casual. Julia asked a simple question, "Who is she?" But the quick flash of defensiveness in his eyes told her more than words could. "Just business," he said, brushing it off. "Don't start making it something else." Julia didn't push, though suspicion gnawed at her. She had no proof, only fragments. The late nights, the evasive answers, the smell of perfume, not her own, lingering faintly on his jacket. Still, the pieces formed a picture she could no longer ignore. The arguments began quietly at first. Julia would ask when he planned to stay the night again. Michael would sigh, mutter something about deadlines, and accuse her of being clingy. When she tried to talk about Evelyn's funeral and the way his family had behaved, he dismissed her concerns, saying she was too emotional. "You're letting grief cloud your judgment," he snapped once. "My mom and aunt were just being practical. You should appreciate that instead of twisting it into something ugly." Julia stared at him, anger tightening her chest. Practical? They were talking about Evelyn's estate before we'd even left the cemetery. That isn't practical, it's heartless. He rolled his eyes, already reaching for his phone. "You always exaggerate. Maybe if you focused more on us and less on my family, things would be easier." The words stung, but Julia held them in. She didn't want to become the woman who begged for scraps of affection. Still, each fight left her feeling smaller, as though her world was narrowing to the edges of his indifference. It was Rachel Myers, her oldest friend, who noticed the change in her first. Over coffee at a small cafe downtown, Rachel studied Julia's pale face and the dark circles beneath her eyes. "You're wasting away," Rachel said bluntly. "And don't tell me it's just work. I know you." Julia stirred her coffee without meeting her gaze. "It's Michael. He's distant. I think there might be someone else." Rachel reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Then you need to ask yourself if you're willing to live with that. Because you deserve better than being someone's afterthought." Later that week, Daniel Reed, a fellow teacher at the high school, offered a gentler warning. They were grading papers in the empty staff lounge when he noticed Julia staring blankly at her work. "You've been off lately," Daniel said. "If it's personal, I don't need the details, but don't lose yourself in someone else's shadow. I've seen too many good people do that." Julia forced a smile, touched by his kindness. "Thank you, Daniel. I'll be fine." But inside, she knew she wasn't fine. She felt abandoned, strung along, and increasingly aware that Michael and his family saw her less as a partner and more as a resource to be tapped when convenient. The realization hollowed her, yet she still clung to the remnants of hope. Hope that maybe she was wrong, that maybe her fears were only grief magnified. At night, as the rain pattered against her windows, Julia lay awake with Morka curled against her side. She thought of Evelyn's warning. "Don't let them mistake your kindness for weakness." The words echoed louder now, a reminder that while she was being neglected and possibly betrayed, she was not powerless. Still, doubt lingered, and the cracks in her relationship with Michael spread deeper each day. It was late on a rainy Thursday when Julia stopped by Michael's family home to drop off some papers he had forgotten. She hadn't planned on staying. Just hand them over and leave. But when she arrived, the house was quiet, the front door slightly ajar. She stepped inside, calling softly, "Michael?" Voices drifted from the living room. Julia froze in the hallway, her breath catching as she recognized Michael's voice, low and serious. His mother, Linda, responded in a sharp whisper. You can't wait forever, Linda said. She owns that apartment outright. Once you're married, it will be easier to fold it into your assets. You need to make sure it's in both your names. Julia's blood ran cold. Michael exhaled loudly. I know, Mom, but she's hesitant. She acts like it's her sanctuary. I can't just demand the keys. Linda's tone hardened. Then charm her. You've done it before. She's vulnerable. Look at how she clung to Evelyn. Use that. Don't waste time. The words struck Julia like a physical blow. Her knees weakened, and she pressed herself against the wall to keep from collapsing. Her apartment, her only refuge, the place she had built with her own hard work, wasn't just something they were curious about. It was a target, the prize in their quiet, calculated scheme. Michael's voice again, colder this time. She'll come around. She trusts me, and once everything's in order, she won't have a choice. Julia's hand flew to her mouth to stifle the gasp threatening to escape. Tears blurred her vision as betrayal settled in, heavier than anything she had felt since Aaron years ago. She remembered Evelyn's sharp eyes, her steady voice. Don't ignore your instincts. She had tried to believe in Michael, to dismiss the signs, but now the truth was undeniable. Her mind flashed back to all the moments she had brushed off. The perfume on his jacket, the late nights, the probing questions from Linda and Victoria. Each puzzle piece snapped into place with cruel clarity. They hadn't loved her. They hadn't even respected her. They had seen her as a means to an end, a stepping stone toward security and wealth. Julia backed away from the living room, her pulse pounding in her ears. She slipped out the door silently, the cold air hitting her like a slap. Rain poured harder now, soaking her coat as she hurried down the steps, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were a whirlwind: fury, grief, humiliation. By the time she reached her car, her tears mixed with the rain streaming down her face. She sat behind the wheel, gripping it so tightly her knuckles whitened. Evelyn's voice returned to her again, clearer than ever. Trust your instincts. She had ignored them for too long, silenced them in the name of love, in the desperate hope that this time would be different. But Evelyn had been right. Instincts were not lies. They were warnings. And now Julia knew the truth. She drove home in silence, every mile widening the distance, not just between her and Michael's house, but between her and the version of herself who had once believed in him. Murka greeted her with a plaintive cry at the door, and Julia bent to scoop the cat into her arms, pressing her face into the soft fur as sobs broke free. For hours she paced the apartment, replaying the conversation over and over. Betrayal sat like poison in her chest, yet beneath the devastation, something steadier began to form. She thought of Evelyn's funeral, of Michael checking his phone while she poured her heart into honoring his grandmother. She thought of Linda's sharp questions, Victoria's calculating smiles, and she thought of Michael himself, how he had once charmed her, only to discard her care the moment it conflicted with his ambition. Julia wiped her face, her expression hardening. No more excuses, no more waiting for him to change. She would not let them take from her the one place that was truly hers, the one thing that represented her independence and resilience. By the time dawn broke, gray light creeping into the apartment, Julia's decision was made. She would end it. Whatever love she had clung to was gone, shattered by the truth she had overheard. She would not be Michael's victim. She would not let his family strip her of her dignity or her home. Her heart still ached, but there was resolve now where only doubt had lived before. Julia Dawson had trusted her instincts at last, and they told her clearly it was time to walk away. Julia didn't call ahead. She knew if she did, Michael would find a way to avoid her, to twist her words or delay the inevitable. Instead, she drove to his office the next afternoon, her hands steady on the wheel despite the storm raging in her chest. The rain beat down against Portland streets, a relentless percussion that mirrored her resolve. Michael looked up from his desk as she entered, surprise flickering across his face before he masked it with that practiced smile. "Julia, I wasn't expecting you." She shut the door behind her. "We need to talk." He leaned back in his chair, casual, as though this was just another negotiation. "If this is about the other night, my mother tends to exaggerate. Don't let her put ideas in your head." Julia's voice was calm, sharper than she intended. "I heard you, Michael. Both of you. Talking about my apartment, about how to make it yours after we got married. You weren't planning a future with me. You were planning a future with my home." His smile faltered, then returned, thinner now. "Julia, you misunderstood." "No," she cut in. "For months, I've ignored my instincts. I told myself you were busy, that your family was just curious. But I won't ignore them anymore. Evelyn told me to trust them, and I am." At the mention of his grandmother, Michael's face darkened. "You think you're some saint because you played nurse for her? She was my family, not yours." Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't waver. "She trusted me more than she trusted you. She asked me to care for her, to honor her wishes. And I did. You couldn't even stay at the hospital long enough to say goodbye." For the first time, Michael was silent. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching on the desk. "This is over," Julia said finally. "Whatever we had, it's done. You and your family will not touch my home, my life, or anything that belongs to me. I'm walking away, Michael. And you're going to live with the fact that you lost me, not because I wasn't enough, but because you never cared to see that I was." She turned before he could reply, the slam of the door punctuating her words. In the weeks that followed, the Dawsons tried their best. Linda called under the guise of reconciliation, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Victoria sent messages hinting at family obligations. Even Michael appeared once at Julia's door, rain dripping from his coat, eyes pleading. But Julia didn't open it. She had made her choice, and no amount of charm or manipulation would undo it. Her apartment remained hers alone, a fortress she guarded not with locks, but with the strength Evelyn had helped her find. She threw herself back into her teaching, rediscovering joy in her students' essays and the laughter echoing through the classroom. The emptiness Evelyn left never truly vanished, but Julia filled it by caring for Morka, by keeping the old woman's memory alive in small rituals. The tea they used to share, the walks through Mount Tabor when the rain lightened. Often, Julia visited Mrs. Carter, bringing Morka along. The elderly neighbor would smile through tears, stroking the cat's fur as they reminisced about Evelyn. Together, they kept her spirit alive, not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of remembering. Rachel remained by Julia's side, her friendship a steady anchor. Daniel checked in often at work, his concern quiet but genuine. Slowly, Julia realized she was not alone, that her world could expand beyond Michael's shadow, beyond the pain his family had caused. And Michael? Word drifted back through mutual acquaintances. His contracts fell through. Rumors spread of arguments with Crystal Moore, who disappeared from his life as quickly as she had entered it. Linda and Victoria squabbled over Evelyn's meager estate, bitter when they realized much of what they had hoped for no longer existed. Their schemes unraveled without Julia's apartment to latch onto. Julia never gloated. She didn't need to. Their downfall was their own doing, the natural consequence of greed and neglect. Her revenge was silent, woven into the life she rebuilt without them. One evening, weeks later, Julia slipped on her coat and stepped outside. The rain was steady but soft, falling like a curtain over the city. She walked down the familiar streets, the glow of Portland's street lamps shimmering on wet pavement. For the first time in years, she felt no fear, no hesitation. The betrayal still scarred her, but it no longer defined her. She carried Evelyn's memory in her heart, Morka's soft purr at home, and the certainty that she had chosen dignity over despair. As the rain soaked her hair and the city hummed quietly around her, Julia Dawson smiled faintly. Freedom wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the simple act of walking into the night, unafraid, knowing she had reclaimed her life. Her sweet revenge was not in striking back, but in living well, while those who betrayed her were left with nothing but the echo of their own greed. The sky that morning wasn't quite right. Laura Bennett stood at the kitchen sink of her old two-story home in Salem, Massachusetts, her hands motionless under the running water. Outside, the clouds were rolling low and fast, casting long shadows over the autumn-colored trees. There was something in the air, something she couldn't name, but felt in her bones. Not the chill of October, something older, heavier. "Mommy, the clouds look like wolves today," Emma's voice echoed from the living room. The little girl was crouched by the window, drawing in the condensation with her tiny finger. Her curly hair caught the morning light, a halo over a furrowed brow. Laura forced a smile and wiped her hands. "Yes, they do, but we don't have time for stories today, sweetie. Your dad's got a big trip, remember." Right on cue, footsteps creaked down the upstairs hallway. David Bennett, tall and sharp in his navy suit, descended the staircase with his phone in one hand and a half-finished coffee in the other. His presence filled the room like perfume that lingered too long, appealing on the surface but cloying underneath. "I've got a make-or-break pitch in New York this weekend," he said, leaning down to kiss Emma's head. "Be good, my little star. I'll bring you something amazing when I get back." Emma looked up at him, her big brown eyes uncertain. "Promise?" David smiled, white teeth smooth charm. "Promise." Laura watched silently as he picked up his briefcase. Her gaze lingered on his wristwatch. Expensive new. She didn't remember seeing it before. He hadn't said who gifted it, or when. She glanced at the calendar. 3 months since her mother died. 3 months since David had changed, ever so slightly. The longer work hours. The late-night phone calls in the garage. The way he flinched when she entered a room without warning. And now this trip. "I spoke to Mom," David added, casually adjusting his tie. "She's coming by Sunday." Laura blinked. "Gloria's coming here?" "She misses Emma." Of course. Gloria missed Emma. But not Laura. Never Laura. To her, Laura had always been the barely tolerated daughter-in-law who took David off his path. Everything Gloria ever said came sugar-coated, but sharp-edged. "I'll make up the guest room," Laura said flatly. David leaned in and whispered in her ear. "You don't have to like her. Just don't make things weird while I'm gone." And just like that, he was out the door. The house went quiet. Emma's laughter broke the silence for a moment as she danced across the floor with her plush rabbit, but Laura's thoughts stayed tangled. She moved into her study, the one her mother used to sit in, filled with old books and boxes of paintings yet to be catalogued. She had been meaning to go through her mother's belongings. But every time she tried, something stopped her. The smell of lavender in the drawers, the faint pencil marks on old museum sketches. The memories were still too raw. Then, like a whisper, a voice cut through her thoughts. "Mommy, Grandma told me a secret." Laura turned. Emma stood in the doorway, holding a dusty photograph of Laura as a child. Her eyes gleamed, not with mischief, but something else, something older. "What secret, honey?" Emma shook her head. She said, "I could only tell you when it's time." Laura smiled faintly, trying not to show the chill that ran down her spine. "You dreamt about Grandma again." Emma nodded, but it wasn't just a dream this time. Laura walked over and knelt down, cupping her daughter's cheek. "We'll talk about it later, okay? Let's just have breakfast." But inside, something had already shifted. Outside the window, the clouds began to gather again, and Laura could have sworn they looked like they were watching. The next day, Laura stood in the sunroom, flipping through the schedule for the Salem Women's Art Society while Emma sprawled across the floor nearby, sketching with colored pencils. Outside, the golden leaves fluttered gently down the driveway, and the whole scene should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Laura's phone buzzed. A text from David. "Leaving earlier than planned. Need to prep more. I'll call tonight." She stared at the screen for a long moment, rereading the message. He was supposed to leave tomorrow. Why the sudden change? Emma looked up from her drawing. Daddy's going early? Laura nodded slowly. Seems like it. Emma didn't say anything, but her pencil stopped moving. That evening, as Laura stirred soup on the stove, she noticed Emma sitting unusually still on the living room rug. The flicker of the fireplace cast tall shadows across the walls, and Emma's eyes seemed locked on something invisible, somewhere far away. "What are you thinking about, love?" Emma turned, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw Daddy and Grandma talking on his phone in the garage." Laura's hand paused mid-stir. "When?" "Yesterday. I was looking for my stuffed bunny. They didn't know I was there." "And what were they talking about?" Emma hesitated. "I couldn't hear much. Just a few words. Daddy said, 'She'll never see it coming.' And Grandma said, 'Perfect. It has to look natural.'" The spoon slipped from Laura's hand, clinking hard against the pot. She wiped her palms, trying to keep her voice calm. "Emma, sweetheart, you must have misunderstood. Grown-ups say all sorts of silly things." But Emma didn't smile, didn't blink. Her voice came steady. "I didn't misunderstand. Daddy was holding house papers, and he pointed to something in the hallway." Laura felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her had already known. The strange behavior, the hollow affection, the way David had been avoiding her eyes for weeks. "Time for bed," she said, her voice too light. "Come on, honey. I'll read you your favorite." "No," Emma said quickly, standing up. "I want to sleep in your room." Laura raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong with your room?" "There's something off. I feel it." Laura tried to laugh it off, but Emma didn't budge. Her little fingers clutched the hem of her mother's sweater. "Please." That night, as Emma lay curled beside her, Laura stared at the ceiling, wide awake. Her thoughts ran in spirals around her mother's sudden death, the insurance policy David insisted they signed together a month ago, his repeated questions about whether she'd updated her will. And then there was Emma. Why would a 6-year-old invent something so specific? At 2:14 a.m., Laura sat alone in the study, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating a stack of unopened folders. She hadn't meant to go through David's things, but something pulled her to the bottom drawer. To her surprise, it wasn't locked tonight. Inside, nestled under plain documents, was a red envelope labeled Policy, Laura Bennett. Her hands shook as she opened it. A life insurance contract. High payout. Beneficiary, David Bennett. Date issued 3 weeks after her mother's funeral. The floor beneath her seemed to vanish. She leaned back in the chair, her eyes fixed on the papers, and then she remembered what Emma had said about it having to look natural. The house creaked. A car drove slowly down the road outside, headlights casting shadows against the window blinds. Laura turned off the lamp and sat in darkness, not because she was afraid, because now she believed her daughter. The following morning, the silence in the house felt calculated. Laura stood by the kitchen window, clutching a lukewarm mug of tea, watching the wind ripple through the backyard. The trees didn't sway, so much as shudder. A strange sense of pressure weighed on the air, like the moments before a thunderstorm, but colder. Emma appeared in the hallway, already dressed, her bunny clutched to her chest. "Mommy," she whispered, "we have to leave soon." Laura turned slowly. "Leave?" Emma nodded. Her voice dropped, fragile and urgent. "We have to go before Daddy comes back." Laura walked over, crouched to her daughter's eye level. "Emma, is this about what you said yesterday?" "Yes," she whispered. "And something else." Laura's stomach twisted. Emma pulled a crumpled paper from her pocket. A house plan. An old blueprint. Where had she? "I found it in Daddy's study drawer." "The one under the safe," Emma said softly. "He was looking at it. I saw him last week." He circled something here. She pointed to a long hallway leading to the back door, marked secured access. Laura's breath caught. The door hadn't been replaced since the 40s. There was no reason for it to be secured. And then Emma added almost inaudibly, he was on the phone. He said, "Perfect. No one will know how it happened." By noon, Laura's nerves were fraying. David hadn't answered any of her texts. Gloria had called once earlier, her tone clipped strange. "Has David arrived yet?" she asked. "No." "Why?" "Just let me know when he does." The call ended before Laura could respond. The second she hung up, she heard it, a car engine. Low, slow, pulling up just beyond the hedge. She moved toward the window and froze. A man in a black coat stood beside an unfamiliar SUV, phone to his ear, scanning the house. Not pacing, not lost, watching. Laura pulled Emma close. "We're staying inside today, sweetie." The rest of the afternoon passed like glass cracking under pressure, quiet but ready to shatter. Laura double-checked all the doors, then checked them again. Her heart wouldn't slow down. That night, Emma refused to go to her room. "I'm staying with you again," she insisted, her voice trembling. Laura hesitated. "Emma, are you scared because of what you heard?" Emma nodded quickly. "Mommy, I saw the garage door move. I think someone came inside." Laura wanted to tell her daughter she was wrong, that nothing was happening, that it was all a misunderstanding. But her hands were shaking too much to lie. She tucked Emma into bed beside her and turned out the lights. At 2:08 a.m., Laura's phone buzzed. A message from David. "Coming home early. Big conversation ahead. Be up." No emojis. No hearts. No smiley faces like he always used with Emma. Just cold text. She didn't reply. She lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling. Beside her, Emma shifted slightly and whispered, "Mommy, we have to run now." Laura turned. Her daughter's eyes were wide open. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't dreaming. "What?" "He's coming," Emma whispered. "We have to go. There's no time." Laura's blood ran cold. From the hallway came the sound of the front lock clicking. Her pulse roared in her ears. Metal slammed. One. Then another. All windows, shutters dropping, mechanical and final. They were being sealed in. Laura sprang out of bed, grabbed her coat, her bag. Cash, passport, phone, the locket her mother left behind. "Emma, shoes on. Now." The back door wouldn't turn. The knob jammed. "It's locked from the outside," Emma whispered. Laura swore under her breath. Then came it, the smell. Thick, sour, unmistakable. Gasoline. She grabbed Emma's hand. "We need another way." The fire hadn't started yet, but it would. Any moment now. "Mommy," Emma's voice was calm now. Too calm. "There's a hidden door behind the pantry. It leads underground." Laura blinked. "What?" "I saw it. In my dream. Grandma showed me." A crashing noise came from the living room. Someone inside. Without hesitation, Laura followed her daughter into the kitchen. Emma was already pulling aside the lower shelves. And behind the canned goods, a narrow door no one would have noticed. The door creaked open with the sound of rusted hinges scraping against time itself. A dark, narrow passage yawned before them, cold and damp, barely wider than Laura's shoulders. Dust clung to the walls like cobwebs from another century. The air smelled of old stone and fear. "Emma," Laura whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "How do you know this place is real?" Emma glanced back at her mother, her tiny hand clutching Bunny tighter than ever. "Grandma showed me," she said calmly. "In the dream," she said, "if things go bad, take the pantry door." Laura hesitated. The smell of gasoline was thicker now. Something upstairs crashed. The sound of footsteps. Boots. Time was up. She nodded once. "You go first. Stay close to the wall. Crawl if you have to." Emma didn't flinch. She dropped to her knees and disappeared into the shadows. Laura followed, her heart pounding so loud it echoed inside her skull. The passage tilted downward, forcing her to crouch. Her hands scraped against jagged stone. Every breath was a gasp of stale air and adrenaline. Behind them, crackling, a low roar. The house was beginning to burn. They crawled in silence for what felt like hours. Laura's knees screamed. Her throat was raw from breathing smoke-tainted air. Her bag kept bumping into her ribs with every shuffle. "Are you okay?" Emma's voice floated back. "I'm with you," Laura panted. "Keep going." "Almost there," Emma said. "It comes out by the garden shed." Laura stopped. "How do you know?" Emma didn't turn around. "I just do." A rumble shook the tunnel. Dust rained from above. Laura's mind raced. Was the fire spreading this far down? Would the walls collapse? But then a sliver of light, faint but there. At the end of the narrow corridor stood a crooked wooden panel. Emma pushed it gently. The wood groaned, then gave way. They spilled out into a low, dirt-floored room, cold, silent, and forgotten. The inside of the shed's underground chamber. Old tools, rusted chains, jars of who knows what. The smell of earth was overwhelming, but blessedly free of smoke. Laura hoisted Emma up the wooden stairs. The door above them creaked open. And just like that, morning air. Cool, crisp, freedom. They emerged behind the shed at the far end of the backyard, the burning house blocked by trees. But they could see it, black smoke twisting into the sky like the fingers of a monster. Sirens wailed in the distance. "Come on," Laura whispered. "We have to move." They cut through the neighbor's lawn, Laura carrying Emma now, feet soaked with dew, heart threatening to burst. They reached the porch of Janelle Carter's house, just as flames burst through the second-story windows behind them. Laura pounded on the door with her fist. "Janelle!" Inside, a light flicked on. The door opened. Janelle, in her robe, blinked. "Laura." Laura could barely stand. "Call the police," she gasped. "David, he tried to kill us." Emma clung to her mother's coat. Ash streaked across her cheeks. For a moment, Janelle didn't move. Then she grabbed the phone. "Get inside. Now." Laura collapsed onto the couch. Her knees gave out. Emma crawled onto her lap, her breath shallow but steady. Outside, the house roared in agony. Inside, the truth began to rise from the flames. Laura sat stiffly on the floral-patterned couch in Janelle's living room, a borrowed blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Emma curled beside her like a frightened animal. The smell of smoke clung to them both, stubborn and sickening. Laura could still feel the heat of the fire crawling up her back. Across the room, Janelle was pacing with her cordless phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, they're safe now," she said urgently. "No injuries, but they need help. You need to send someone now." The sound of approaching sirens filled the neighborhood. Laura blinked hard, trying to focus. Her mind buzzed with too many things at once. The hidden tunnel, the life insurance papers, the man in the black coat, and above all, David's voice in her head. It has to look natural. She reached for her purse with trembling hands and pulled out the red envelope. "Janelle," she whispered hoarsely, "can you get me a glass of water and something to write on?" Janelle brought her a notepad, but Laura shook her head. "No, not to write. I need to show the police this. It's insurance. He took out a policy. In my name. Just after my mother passed." Janelle's eyes widened, her voice dropping. "Oh, my God!" There was a knock at the door. Flashing lights danced against the windows. 2 officers and a fire marshal stood outside, one already radioing in the blaze engulfing the Bennett house down the road. Laura stood up too fast. "Detective, you need to listen to me. This wasn't an accident." The older officer, Detective Marsh, looked her over skeptically. "Ma'am, you were in that house?" Laura nodded. "My husband locked me and my daughter inside. He set the fire. We escaped through an old tunnel behind the pantry. Detective Marsh glanced at the other officer. That's a serious claim. I have proof, Laura said quickly, holding up the envelope. Insurance. He took it out right after my mother died. And my daughter, she heard him, planning it, with his mother. At that, Marsh's brow furrowed. He stepped forward and gently took the documents from her hands, flipping through them. You say he left earlier for a business trip? He never left, Laura said. He texted me last night, said he'd be back early. Then everything started shutting down. The house was rigged. Emma, still wrapped in the blanket, looked up. He said, If Mommy's gone, everything becomes mine. I heard it. Marsh turned to Emma, his tone softer now. Where were you when you heard that, sweetheart? Outside his study, she said. He didn't know I was listening. He was talking on the phone with Grandma Gloria. Laura felt her heart break at the steadiness in Emma's voice. She was so small, yet she sounded so certain. So much older than 6. More officers arrived, along with fire investigators who cordoned off the area and began their preliminary assessment. One of them walked back up the porch an hour later, his expression grim. Detective, he said, we've got clear signs of accelerants, gasoline, spread along the baseboards. Also, something weird with the security system. All windows and doors locked from outside. Someone rewired it to lock remotely. Marsh's face hardened. Get an APB out for David Bennett, he ordered. Now. By sunset, news came in. David had been located at a gas station along the interstate, trying to withdraw cash with a false ID. A large duffel bag of burner phones, cash, and travel documents was found in his trunk. When confronted, he screamed in the interrogation room, It wasn't me. It was my mother's idea. She pushed me. Hours later, Gloria Bennett was arrested at her home. She didn't resist. She didn't even flinch. But when informed that David was placing the blame squarely on her, something cracked in her perfectly composed mask. That ungrateful boy, she hissed. After everything I did for him, everything I gave up, her voice trembled. I did it for him. 3 months later, the courtroom was silent. The only sound was the shuffle of papers and the ticking of a wall clock, steady like a countdown. The trial of David Bennett and Gloria Bennett had captured statewide attention. The headlines called it the Salem Inferno case, but to Laura it wasn't just a case. It was her life and almost her death. She sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly, watching as the prosecution laid out the evidence. Blueprints of the house, marked with escape route modifications. The tampered security system, reprogrammed to lock from the outside. Traces of gasoline along the floorboards. Life insurance documents, signed just after her mother's death. Call logs between David and Gloria, dozens of them, right before the fire. David's attorney tried to plead diminished responsibility, claiming stress, manipulation, confusion, even suggesting Laura might have set the fire herself. The room murmured in disbelief. Then David shifted strategies. It was all her, he said, pointing at his mother across the courtroom. She pushed me. She said Laura was ruining my life. She said if we just got rid of her, we could start over with the money. Gasps filled the gallery. Gloria stood, her face hard as stone. I sacrificed everything for you, she hissed, loud enough for the whole room to hear. I gave you everything, and you still blame me? Her mask shattered. She confessed, not to starting the fire, but to helping plan it. Laura was poison, she said, her voice trembling with fury. She stole my son's future. I thought, if she disappeared, maybe David could become the man he was meant to be. But it wasn't her voice that shifted the jury. It was Emma's. The courtroom adjusted the mic to her height. She wore a small blue dress, her hair tied back in a ribbon, bunny tucked under her arm. State your name, please. Emma Bennett. And how old are you? 6.5. Emma, the prosecutor said gently, can you tell the jury what you heard that night? Emma nodded. Daddy was on the phone. He didn't know I was outside the study. He said, "If Mommy is gone, everything becomes mine." Gasps echoed again. Laura closed her eyes. "And what else?" He said, "We just need to make it look like an accident." A pause. "Did you tell anyone?" "I told Mommy," Emma whispered. "And I told Bunny." The courtroom chuckled softly at that. But there were tears in the eyes of at least 3 jurors. "And how did you know about the secret tunnel?" "Grandma told me," Emma said simply. There was silence. "Your Grandma Gloria?" Emma shook her head. "No, Mommy's Mommy. In my dream. She said, 'If things go bad, follow the pantry door.' So I did." The silence stretched long and deep. Even the judge blinked slowly, visibly moved. Emma smiled slightly. Grandma was right. When the verdict was read, Laura couldn't breathe. Guilty, on all counts. David, 15 years in state prison for attempted arson, attempted murder, and insurance fraud. Gloria, 8 years for conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder. But it wasn't the sentencing that stuck with Laura. It was the moment David turned around, expecting someone, anyone, to look at him with sympathy. No one did, not even his mother. And when Gloria was led away in cuffs, her final words were barely a whisper. "I did everything for my son, and now I have nothing." Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, but Laura shielded Emma with her coat and kept walking. They didn't need headlines. They had each other, and more than that, they had truth. 6 months later, the world had settled into a different rhythm. The new house Laura bought sat at the edge of a quiet street in a small New England town. Not grand, not historic, not full of ghosts. Just safe. The garden was modest, the roof a little slanted, but the air was light here. The shadows were honest. That afternoon, Laura stood by the kitchen window, sipping tea, watching leaves dance across the stone walkway. Emma's backpack lay by the door, her tiny boots streaked with sidewalk chalk from art class. The sun poured into the house like forgiveness. "Mommy!" Emma's voice rang from outside. A moment later, she burst through the door, holding a drawing. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, eyes bright with pride. "My picture got picked for the art exhibition. Ms. Hill said it's going on the front wall." Laura crouched, taking the drawing with a smile. It was a crayon depiction of 3 women, Emma, Laura, and a woman with gray hair in a garden full of stars. "Is that Grandma?" Laura asked gently. Emma nodded. "She's watching us. She helps me feel brave." Laura pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "She'd be so proud of you." They sat together by the fireplace that evening, curled up in thick blankets. A small tree twinkled in the corner. Emma had insisted they put it up early for Christmas. Dr. Thomas Avery, Emma's counselor and now a close friend, joined them just before dinner. He brought cinnamon rolls and laughter. Over the months, his visits had become more frequent, at first as a therapist, then as something gentler, quieter, someone who fit. Emma had noticed too. "Mommy," she asked later, when Thomas had stepped outside to take a call, "what's a real family?" Laura looked at her for a long moment. "It's not about blood," she said. "It's about love, about being safe, about choosing each other every day." Emma thought for a while, then smiled. "That's why we made it, because we're a real family now." Laura felt something bloom in her chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't survival. It was beginning. Later that night, Laura was organizing a few old boxes from her mother's things. Among the art books and letters, she found a notebook tied with ribbon. Inside, folded delicately, was a handwritten letter. "Laura, if you're reading this, I've probably already left this world. There's something I want to warn you about. David came to me for money. He was charming but desperate. I checked into his company. It's a lie. Please protect Emma. And protect yourself. If anything happens to me suddenly, don't assume it's natural." Mom Laura closed the letter with shaking hands. Her mother had known. She had seen it coming. Maybe that's why Emma saw it too. The next morning, Laura submitted the letter to the police. A new investigation into her mother's death was opened, and this time no detail would be overlooked. On Christmas Eve, the three of them sat together, Laura, Emma, and Thomas, watching snow fall in gentle swirls through the window. Music played softly from the radio. No sirens, no flames, just peace. Can Michael become part of our family? Emma asked suddenly, looking up at Thomas with innocent curiosity. Thomas chuckled, glancing at Laura, who blushed despite herself. We'll talk about that, he said gently. Together. Emma grinned, then nestled against her mother's side. Laura looked at the fire, at the new warmth surrounding her, and whispered into her daughter's hair. Your courage saved our lives and gave us this new one. And as snow blanketed the roof above them, Laura Bennett closed her eyes for just a moment, grateful, grounded, and finally free.